Dear colleagues, dear esteemed guests, good morning again. We would like to welcome you at the round table of the New Europe Center today, which is dedicated to a very burning issue of sanctions against Russia in the aftermath of the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We are going to talk today about how to preserve the European unity. I would like to welcome today all the esteemed guests and speakers who are going to represent today the government of Ukraine and the governments of the European member states, as well as the representatives of the Ukrainian NGOs and civil society, human rights activists. I will introduce everyone in due course. For now, I would just like to say that we are going to start our event in English, so please use the headphones for everyone who needs the simultaneous translation. Simultaneous translation will be available in some 5 to 10 minutes, so thank you for your patience. The event is supported, and the analysis which we have prepared and which we're about to present was supported by the Black Sea Trust, the project of the German Marshall Fund, to whom we are grateful. And my name is Kateryna Zarembo. I'm Deputy Director of the New Europe Center. And right now, my colleague Tatyana Levanyuk and I will present some research about how sanctions actually affect the European Union, and then we will discuss our findings and more. What's going on? What is going to happen to sanctions within the current revision, which is pending in December 2018 and onwards. So, without further ado, I would like to give word to my colleague Tatyana Levanyuk, who will show us today the effect of sanctions on the economies of the European Union member states. As you know well, we've heard a lot about criticism from various member states about how sanctions actually harm the European Union. We decided to pick up the open data provided by the European Statistical Services and analyze to which extent this claim is true. And we will also prepare some commentaries on several specific individual member states. And this is available in this publication, which was provided at the entrance, which will also available online after this event. So, Tatyana, would you please let us know what are the key findings from the data analysis on the effect on sanctions on the European Union, please?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to say that representatives of different member states of the European Union have repeatedly complained that sanctions do some damage to their economies, and some politicians were talking about billions of losses, and actually about the influence of Russian countermeasures on the EU economies. And especially its agricultural production. And today, regarding and using the open statistics from the Eurostat, as well as several statistical agencies of the EU members, we will try to show you what is the real impact of these sanctions on the EU economies. Now, I would like to present our infographics and then say a few words just about our policy commentaries. So, the first infographics, you can see that the share of goods banned from export to the Russian Federation constitute just 0.3% of all extra-EU exports, so-called exports to the third countries. And actually, during the 2013-2017, the EU exports to the Russian Federation fell about just 2.3%, which constitute just 3 cups of coffee for every citizen of the European Union. well, the next one. Here you can see that the average reduction in share exports to Russia out of total EU exports in 2017 compared to 2013 is just 2.3%. And as you can see, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland are the biggest so-called victims of the sanctions policy against Russia. Compared to the biggest economies of the European Union, whose percent is just for Austria 1.7, for Germany 1.3, for Italy 1 point, and etc. And here you can see that some countries like Bulgaria, Luxembourg, Cyprus, and Malta, the share exports to Russia out of total exports of these countries have increased. Well, the next one, here you can see that the European Union has diversified its agricultural exports. And since 2014, the rise in exports of agricultural products from the European Union to third countries is 3 times bigger than the decline in such exports to the Russian Federation. And here we can see the real impact of so-called Russian countermeasures on the agricultural production of the European Union and its members. The next one, here you can see that in 2007, compared to 2016, 26 countries of the European Union, with the exception of Malta and Croatia, showed an increase in exports to the Russian Federation. Well, here we can see that exports from France increased by 12%, from Italy by 16%, and from Germany by 17%. The average growth for the European Union is 12%. And this infographic illustrates that sanctions is not the only source of damage to the EU economies, and the decline in exports to the Russian Federation, because there is a theory that some issues like the changement in prices of oil and other factors also influenced the increase or decrease in exports to the Russian Federation of all EU members. So the next one, here we can see that despite sanctions, 26 EU members saw trade with Russia go up in 2018. We just compared the first and second quarters of 2018 compared to the same period of the 2017. And here you can see that such countries as Austria and Hungary are in top 10 of EU members with increase in trade with Russia. And actually, just for going to our policy commentaries, I would like to say that during the latest times, from some countries, we can hear more active claims about the losses of their economies from the sanctions, anti-Russian sanctions, and Russian countermeasures. And these countries, from our opinion, are Austria, Italy, and Hungary. And actually, in our policy commentaries, you can read more detailed information about this situation. And I would like just to conclude, say that Italy today is the most active country regarding claims about the big losses from the anti-Russian sanctions and Russian countermeasures. And such countries as Austria and Hungary can be initiators of the so-called club of EU members against the sanctions contra Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. My colleagues are telling me that the simultaneous translation is already available. So please allow me to switch into Ukrainian then. Колеги, дуже дякую. Вже зараз є наявним переклад синхронний.
Dear colleagues, as we now have simultaneous translation, I take this opportunity to remind you that we have two working languages with simultaneous translation, Ukrainian and English. And now I would like to turn the floor over to Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Germany to Ukraine, Mr. Reichel. We are extremely interested to hear your opinion about the analysis that we have just heard. And what results do you foresee for the next meeting of the European Council? And in the light, in particular, of the recent events, recent accident in the Kerch Bay. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me start by a short commentary on the data that has been explained here. I have, of course, no basis to contest the data which you have collected, clear. It's been a discussion we have had inter alia in Germany since the sanctions came into force, whether or not there was a really serious effect on the economies of the EU as a whole, economy of in the EU as a whole, or in individual member states. Already back when the sanctions were put in place, it was notable that the effect was not dramatic. But one has to say, on the other hand, what is maybe not as apparent as would be fair in the analysis you have made. I think the story is that there was, of course, as to be expected, a sort of shock when the sanctions came into force. And then over the years, the firms and the economies concerned compensated for this shock by diversifying their exports and so on. So when the whole story of sanctions began, the effect was more marked than it appears if you compare 2013 to 2017. The other qualification I would make is that you have compared data on economy as a whole, as a rule. There's a little bit about agricultural products, if I'm not mistaken, but overall they are the aggregated data of the entire economy. That doesn't exclude, and I think that's a fact, that certain business areas and certain regions in Europe have been particularly affected, when insofar as they were particularly dependent on Russian, on the business with Russia. I'm thinking, for instance, in Germany, an example is shipbuilding. Shipbuilding was oriented in northeastern Germany, was much oriented towards the Russian market, and there the losses for individual firms, not aggregated statistical data, but for individual firms were dramatic and existential, and so this effect translated into politics, not so much the aggregated data. Now on sanctions more generally, because you asked about this. Well, you know, of course, we have sanctions in place since the beginning since the Crimean annexation and since the beginning of the war in the Donbass. Some of them are related to the annexation of Crimea. Others are designed as an incentive for Russia to fulfill the Minsk agreements. And they fall roughly in two categories. The one category is the personal sanctions against persons who have been either individually responsible or seen as responsible for the events that are being sanctioned. And secondly, also sanctions against persons who are seen as people who have illegally benefited from their office in the period of President Yanukovych. I'll give you an example for these. So these are the personal sanctions, and then come economic sanctions, if you want to call it that way. That is, for instance, for certain areas of business between Russia and the European Union. One example is sanctions on the equipment and services for the exploitation of new sites in the oil and gas business in Russia. That was another example on Crimea. For instance, we have sanctions in place which relate to import of goods from Crimea, transport, communications, energy, and exploitation of natural resources in Crimea, tourism in Crimea, and foreign investment into Crimea. All of this is, these are the areas which are affected by EU sanctions relating to Crimea. And of course, that was also mentioned, there were then Russian counter-sanctions which were designed to hurt as much as possible particular European businesses. For instance, agricultural, the cheese, which was in the picture, yeah, represents Camembert or other French cheese, which was no longer available in Russia. And the EU updates its sanctions regularly. It has listed additional people for the building of the Kerch Bridge. It is about to include further persons in the sanctions list that were involved in the illegal elections in the uncontrolled areas of Donbass. So there is updating going on a fairly continuous basis, driven by events. And of course, there has been criticism of within EU and member states as regards sanctions since 2014. That is, in a pluralistic democratic society, that's a normality. Nonetheless, of course, here in Ukraine, every individual statement made, which was criticism of sanctions, was very attentively picked up and reported, and maybe distorted a little bit the perception. But I have to say, on the other hand, there is clearly a limit to the amount of sanctions that democratically elected politicians in EU member states can advocate or decide without provoking serious criticism directed to them, and either in their own constituencies or in the discussion among EU member states. And sometimes, not in this study, but sometimes that is not sufficiently understood here in Ukraine, where people tend to, of course, easily make demands to the EU and its member states, but don't have to worry so much about whether these demands are politically realistic and can actually be put into action. The fact is, and I think also this study shows it, the EU debate right now is less about additional sanctions against Russia on a major scale, but about the effort to defend the existing sanctions. That's a fact that may not seem fair here in Ukraine, and I understand this, but this is the way the discussion is going on outside the borders of Ukraine. Maybe I'll add one more point, if you allow. When sanctions were put into place, that was done after careful consultation among international actors. A balance was found within the international community to identify areas in which one could inflict costs on Russia without hurting oneself more than necessary. Clear. You have to be smart about sanctions. You have to pick the areas where you inflict costs but don't hurt yourself as much And secondly, the discussion was at the time about division of labor, division about burden sharing. You know, it is individual economies of sanctioning countries have different focus in their trade relationships with Russia. Some buy gas, you know. Others sell IT services and equipment. Yeah? And so you have to find a balance between, if you want consensus and cohesion among the group, you have to find a balance in the sanctions you then finally apply. And that was done at that time successfully. But today, unfortunately, we're in a different game because the United States have a new policy which runs under the logo America First, and they have imposed punitive customs duties on steel and aluminium to benefit their own producers. They have imposed extraterritorial sanctions on companies trading with Iran unilaterally, but addressed to countries and to firms in allied countries, which they have in fact no jurisdiction over, but they still do it. And they are threatening further punitive tariffs because there are, in the view of some, too many high-priced German cars being sold to American customers. So trade war and sanctions is no longer are no longer terms which are only in use with relation to Russia, but are also in use among allied countries, and that's worrying. Yeah? And it should be particularly worrying, if I may say so, to Ukraine, because Ukraine is, in my view, more than any other country maybe, dependent on Western cohesion and unified Western positions. Voilà. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Reichel. Дуже дякуємо. Дуже багато.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Reichel. You have communicated, you have informed us of a number of aspects that are certainly interesting to us. I would like to thank you, and I would like to ask you again if, to your knowledge, on December the 13th, the meeting would result in new sanctions or not?
There is an ongoing discussion about sanctions. Yeah? These sanctions relate to the illegal elections in Donbass. Yeah? This is probably not a matter which will go up to the level of heads of state and government. As for while we're having this, while we have just imposed sanctions on the building of the Kerch Bridge, while there is discussion going on about sanctions relating to 11th of November. Now we are again facing the question about sanctions, this time because of the incident that took place in the Black Sea near the Kerch Strait. And as far as this is concerned, at the moment there is no consensus within the European Union to really go ahead with additional sanctions, because one feels the imminent task which we really have before us is to make sure that this conflict that has arisen does not escalate further into something which can spin out of control. This does not, in my personal view, doesn't exclude that at some time we will come back to this issue of sanctions, but it is felt, at least by some member states, including my country, that it would be counterproductive at this particular moment to go again at sanctions against Russia, because there is already too much tension in the whole story. Yeah.
But the sectoral sanctions, which are already in place, will they be rolled over on the 13th for another half a year?
Well, that is a discussion which we have regularly. You have described, or you have pointed at a few member states which may or may not ask for further discussions and have questions about this. What the outcome of this is, I can't really clearly predict, but But I think we are confident that at the end, as in the past, we will come down with the rollover of the sanctions as they exist, yes.
Thank you very much. Дуже дякую. Справді, мене дуже зацікавила теза, яку висловив пан посол, що є межа санкціям, які можуть.
Well, I was glad to hear Mr. Ambassador's remark about the limit to the sanctions that one country can introduce, a democratic country can introduce. But as a Ukrainian, I ask myself about the limits to what we deem as an aggression. And here I would like to turn the floor over to a representative of the President's administration, the President of Ukraine's administration. What about the negotiations, the top-level negotiations, as we are informed that there are some negotiations on strengthening sanctions against the Russian Federation? Well, thank you for your invitation. In our work, a great significance is indeed attached not only to the new sanctions or reinforcement of the existing sanctions, but rather to dispelling a myth that is used in order to weaken the unity of Western European countries. And one of the instruments here, as I see it, is this instrument of the sanctions. It strengthens the Euro-Atlantic solidarity, and I think it's only in this synergy of the influence, joint influence of the G7 countries and NATO countries, we could reach an impact on a country that we consider aggressor country, and make it recognize the borders of the former Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, or internationally nowadays recognized borders. We know that the Russian authorities, they try to counter the sanctions as much as they can, but for them, these sanctions were a nasty surprise, and in some areas, for some industrial sectors or economic sectors, for some companies, these sanctions were indeed an unpleasant surprise. But I would certainly agree with the ambassador. And the Mr. Ambassador confirmed that the diversification has saved a lot of companies and industries from the losses that have been inflicted or were inflicted by the sanctions. And I think that the goods, for example, imported that Russia used to import from Italy, from Germany, from France, they might as well remain attractive to the Russian consumers after the sanctions are lifted, when the Ukrainian demands are implemented. For example, if certain products are of best quality, these goods hopefully would be continued to be purchased by the consumers in any country. Ukraine was the first that started suffering from the sanctions, and Russia, because of the counter-sanctions on the part of the Russian Federation, and Ukrainian economy was affected quite badly. We hope to compensate for these losses through this association agreement with the European Union, which included also the comprehensive free trade area. As far as Mr. Ambassador's idea or notion of the limits that should be observed, Ukraine on its part is going to put forward as ambitious as possible the ideas and proposals. And certainly Ukraine, we understand it perfectly well, that Ukraine can afford itself much more freedom of movement in this sense than the West European countries or any EU member country for that matter. But our goal is to provide as much pressure on Russia, whom we consider an aggressor, as possible. And after that act of aggression, as we consider it, this arrest of the Ukrainian ships after their 6 hours raid in the Russian territorial waters, they were arrested, and we considered that to be an aggression. And we, after that, had some negotiations, and we are planning more contacts at the level of European institutions, European Union institutions. So we see the picture as we see now the circumstances and the conditions to continue these sanctions for at least next half a year. I think we have these conditions favorable to our requirements and their implementation. On that accident in the Sea of Azov, I think we should try to put a high mark, so to say, to this objective of, make a new package of sanctions against Russia and make the European Union adopt these sanctions. And we suggested, the President of Ukraine, in fact, suggested, or rather submitted the lists of the people, of the vessels and the officials who were involved in these, what we considered the act of aggression in the Sea of Azov, and of the arrest of the Ukrainian servicemen. And as I have already said, we will remain as ambitious as possible, and we will look to it that maximal consensus and maximal agreement is reached, is obtained from our European partners, meaning the European Union partners. Despite all the divergence of opinions among the EU members, we would like to thank all those who supported Ukraine, who endorsed Ukraine's position, and I think the most important is that their political will remains inclined towards Ukraine, and I hope that the words could be sometimes, prompted by some political, conditions, changes of situation, but they still politically even are willing to support Ukraine. If there are any questions, I would be glad to answer them. Thank you, Mr. Serhii. I would like again to focus or to draw your attention to the countries, to the member countries of the EU. Mr. Laslo Powers, who is the representative, Laslo Csaba, who is the deputy ambassador of Hungary to Ukraine. In our discussions with a number of our European partners, we have heard more than once that Hungary could possibly even initiate some removal of the sanctions, or at least their partial abolition or a reduction or whatever. Is that true?
Privilege. Sometimes it's a pleasure. In my case, I would combine both, because it gives a possibility to exchange views, arguments about the reality. And it's a chance for me and for my colleagues also to think it over, how the sanctions and the sanctions policy of the EU are effective. Here I would like to start my remarks with a very modest proposal to change for the next time your title, because the sanctions killers sounds really very interesting, but I think that the essential would be how to win with sanctions, and win what kind of goal to win through the sanctions. And here I would like to immediately tell you that as to the Hungarian approach, we tried to be very consequent and to put the real values and the real threats in the priority rank of actions. For us, the sanctions should serve to reach the sovereignty, the territorial integrity of Ukraine, to reach the goal that your country and your people could choose its own way of development model, of political model, of economic model. And if it is for the European integration, if it is for the Euro-Atlantic cooperation, then Hungary is supporting this. So we think, and I think that the real question is how sanctions and other tools, or other political, economic, social instruments can help Ukraine and the international community to reach again normality in this region through the through solving the problems of Crimea, of the Donbass, and now, unfortunately, the Azov Sea conflict. Hungary was, in this regard, rather consequent, as I told you. We, as you also put it in your analysis regarding the Hungarian approach, we were supporting the unity and the unified actions regarding the sanctions on the side of the European Union. We are following this, and in this regard, I think that on the 13th of December will be a lucky day, a lucky 13th for Ukraine. Personally, me, and as far as I understand, there will be debates. We should, and you should learn from the debates, of course. Those are the reflections of many changes which are going on, which are taking place within Europe, within the European Union, within the Euro-Atlantic community. Those changes are sending daily some kind of messages to all of us, and the real challenge is how to respond, how to meet those new challenges. As to the impact of sanctions on Hungary, I would say that it was significant for a country which is having around 120 billion euro of yearly GDP, as our macro statistics go, we suffered around 7 billion euro of commercial trade losses. It was compensated, as you said, and all of you, that during the last 5 years, Europe was going through an economic recovery, and there was an economic development and progress in most of the member states, not in all, but Hungary was fortunate and lucky enough to be able to compensate these losses. But in my analysis, it is not really the number that matters. Hungary is well, a market economy. And as Mr. Ambassador also pointed out, there is a big difference, for instance, as to the impacts, the potential impacts in the EU member states and in Russia. Russia, which is an oligarchic centralized country, where all those negative impacts could be arranged through the state measures. The population did not, and the enterprises, the firms, the economic life did not have that concrete and direct effect that in market economies, where our firms, our entrepreneurs, our workers, if you want, could directly feel the impact of sanctions, even if it was limited at macro level, but at micro or personal level, there were impacts. And of course, it was a challenge for the political governance, and they, in Hungary as well, had to handle in this or that way this problem. Anyway, politically and diplomatically, we supported the unity of the EU, and we had to find the solutions of those problems which are very characteristic of Hungary. For instance, the energy dependence, which is still existing between Hungary and Russia, and our trade was usually serving the coverage, or to cover that big difference of our incomes, or let's say the paying for the payment for the very high energy account which Hungary has to pay yearly because of our energy dependence. What is the solution? I think the solution is to think it over from time to time, how the sanctions are efficient. We should think it over in the view of how to help Ukraine to win its struggle, her struggle for sovereignty, territorial integrity, for those values. I think some more comprehensive approach will be needed, where we can really mobilize all our assets in order to achieve this. And I think that the EU should also focus on supporting and on strengthening the resilience capacity of Ukraine against the aggression or against the conflicting part. So resilience, it means you're pursuing realizing the reform process, your attachment to European values, your unity within the country. If these factors will prevail, I think that both sanctions and our endeavors will be successful. Thank you.
Дуже вам дякую. Дуже дякую за всі коментарі. Ви знаєте, я знаю, що як модератор я не маю затягувати.
Thank you for your comments, and as a moderator, I'm aware of the fact that I cannot protract our discussion. So we will have time to collect the questions from the audience. But to continue our discussion, you mentioned the figure of losses that Hungary sustained, up to 7 billion euros. According to the data we had, it's an open source data. By 2014, the value of the goods that were sanctioned by the Russian Federation, they amounted only to 78 million. So where does this figure of 7 billion goes from is not clear. If you could please elaborate on that. And I would like to give the floor now to Mr. Giergoń, who is the Minister Counselor of the Embassy of Poland. And my question to you would be: maybe maybe the European Union needs a reassessment, reevaluation of its approach to the Russian Federation. We read, for example, last week an article of two advisors to Commissioner Mogherini, two Italian experts, foreign policy experts, who said that the sanctions against Russia didn't work, were not working practically, and maybe these sanctions should be somehow revised at all. What's your view? What would be your ideas?
Indeed, that's my first intervention at the New Europe Center since my arrival. And I would start with the brief comment that I think we have to understand that the EU is a sui generis organization which needs to, find a common position between 28 states. And this is, first of all, the beauty of this organization, that we find a common solution. But as my predecessor said, obviously, in that kind of organization, we're going to have a debate. And there's always going to be countries which are strong supporters of particular issues. There's going to be countries which are neutral. And there will be countries that will be against. And that is why we have a lot of discussions, sometimes heated, sometimes not in Brussels, in order to find a common position. I think that it's equally important to underline that in 2014, we found it. We found a common position to show that the European Union does not accept the aggressive policy of Russian Federation against Ukraine. That includes illegal annexation, but then again, which annexation is not illegal? Annexation of Crimean Peninsula, but also the aggression in Donbass. Poland has, since the day one, been a strong supporter of this cause. And we do believe that each and every aggressive act by Russia should have a response from Western Hemisphere, let's call it like that. And by the response, I not necessarily mean sanctions, but you can see we've been, each and every particular sectoral sanctions has been rolled over since now. We still have a lot of sanctions in place, and even in 2018, we had, for example, in May, we had a rollover of sanctions on undermining territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And right now, there is a discussion about new sanctions, let's call it like that, very easily, on whether we should impose sanctions on people who are organizing the illegal elections in Donbass, which are in a clear breach of Minsk agreements. And well, I don't want to predict the result because, as Ambassador Reichel perfectly said, this decision will be reached on a top level. But personally, I'm an optimist because I think we should roll over the question. The question is about sanctions is that they are basically kept in place because Russia shows no goodwill and does not decide to make a single step backwards in its aggressive policy towards Ukraine. Just a quick comment on your presentation. I do agree with both Ambassador Reichel and with my Hungarian colleague that the aggregated results not always show the real picture. I remember that in 2014, I have spent significant amount of time, me and my team back in Warsaw, explaining, for example, to our Apple exporters what actually happened. That, you know, Russia was one of the big markets for them, and in a click, they lost a huge market. And I do agree that we were in a period of a sharp plummeting export level, and then it stabilized. So I do believe that when we discuss sanctions, we also have to take into account that particular groups, particular branches will be affected. But then again, we as a European Union, we always try to find a solution which is the less harming for our citizens, in contradiction to what the Russian Federation does, because I do believe the Russian countermeasures, of course, they hit many exporters from Europe, for example, French exporters, Polish exporters. But the problem is, and the main issue is that the countermeasures from Russia are hitting and inflicting significant damage to Russian society. And those ideas that I remember, there was ideas to import crocodile meat, I do believe, or meat from Brazil in order to substitute beef from Europe. Well, it clearly shows that the government in Moscow doesn't take into account the good being of people. But we see that in 2018 we have more and more acts of aggressive policy, whether it's Salisbury, whether it is a situation in Azov Sea. And as you can see, in most of those cases, the European unity has been preserved. Sorry. So the question is, and your question is, should we act in advance, as I understand?
Yes, to announce potential consequences in advance.
But should we, but I don't really understand the concept. That's my idea. So,
like, for example, if there is going to be another attack on Ukraine, another breach of Ukraine's integrity or sovereignty, the consequences are going to be this and that. So, 1, 2, 3.
I'm not a military man, but I do believe that giving bad ideas to the opponent is not always wouldn't find the support in most capitals, and I do believe that in my capital wouldn't be done. The problem is that I think that the continuous process of keeping sanctions in place will, at some point, force Moscow to realize that they need to go back. They have to stop undermining sovereignty of Ukraine and to reflect on their policy on Europe as a whole. But it's also a task for Europe. There is already ongoing academic discussion on how to build new relations of Europe and Russia. For example, what to do with the PCA agreement. It's a very outdated document. There are, I don't remember when was the last summit, EU-Russia summit, envisaged by this act. What to do with the NATO-Russia Funding Act, because what to do with the document which has been already breached. And secondly, and to the last point will be, from our point of view, we support all the discussions that lead to finding particular but very precise solutions how to support Ukraine in the time of aggression again directed by Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for your introduction, for your intervention and your explanations. Я би хотіла зараз надати слово.
Зараз I would like to give the floor now to Mr. Alexander Markus, who is the chairman of the German-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce. And I'm glad that Germany is represented by two high-ranking officials, and referring to the Ambassador Reichel's words and the words of some other speakers who mentioned the damages that were sustained by, or have been sustained by manufacturers, by the companies who exported to the Russian Federation their products and their services. In some countries, we can see that it's usually not in excess of 3%. For example, in Germany, its overall impact was at around 1%. So what we are talking about are the losses sustained by specific companies, a few companies, a few manufacturers or producers. Mr. Giergoń mentioned the fact that in Poland they managed to, to level out, so to say, this impact. And what is the situation in the other countries? Well, maybe it should be explained to the political leaders of your countries on the eve of these discussions on the sanctions of December the 13th. Maybe they should be explained that the impact was not all that significant. And
because I remember when the sanctions began, we had studies from the Eastern Committee of German Economy, which is located in Berlin, and they were announcing that due to the sanctions, that was in 2014, due to the sanctions, Germany could maybe lose around about 600,000 workplaces that were linked to business in Russia. So actually, if you look at sanctions, you have two effects. One is on trade, but then you have foreign companies working inside the country. And there is another effect, because not all German companies are only trading with Russia, they also had invested in Russia, and their markets there are, decreasing. And that is another effect. You have looked only on one effect. You have not looked on the effect on, for example, European business that had invested in Russia, and where maybe due to sanctions, maybe due to the change of the economic situation, due to the devaluation of the Russian ruble, the whole, investment planning had changed. But this is, again, it's about figures. If you speak about the individual companies, yes, indeed, Mr. Reichel is absolutely 100% right. Especially in Eastern Germany, we have some companies that have traditionally had very good relationship to the Soviet Union and continuing with the Russian Federation afterwards. But, my point of view, my personal point of view is, we call it in Germany, it's a political primate, politisches Primat. And that is a political decision. And we can cry over spilled milk. And when we can say, okay, there are some companies who are suffering, and it's very difficult for them because they may have only some markets and they cannot substitute so quickly. But our approach to this question is that this is a political question, and the companies, the economic sphere, has to adapt to this situation. That's all.
Okay. Thank you very much. This explains a lot. Дякую вам дуже за пояснення, за позицію.
Thank you for your explanation, and I invite now Mr. Markus Serhii, who is the Minister Counselor of the Embassy of Estonia. And Estonia is one of the main protagonists, so to say, for this slide. For example, Estonia ranks here with Lithuania and Finland among the countries that sustained largest economic damages and losses after the introduction of the sanctions. I am not sure that in Estonia there were some policies on how to explain these losses. They were just the de facto losses, and but still you managed to cope with them. How? So tell us your success story, please.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel and to share my point of view from representing also Estonia. But it's very difficult for me to add anything new. In fact, especially after Markus pointed, his last statement, I would only have to repeat that. We take it as a political reality, and we proceed from that. When we look at the question that you posed for us today, how to preserve a European unity in context of these sanctions, I think we're all conscious of the fact that these sanctions are at every step a reaction. That we see a situation as a community, as a community of states in Europe, and through an open discussion and honest discussion, we come to a solution that is the most appropriate reaction to that is based on our values. So I think when we look at events, well, most recently from 2014, 2018, you see that at every step where there has been, when the situation has gotten worse, the European Union has in fact reacted appropriately in a new fashion. Jokingly, one could say that the biggest guarantor of European unity in all of this has been Mr. Putin. And that, in fact, when I think some of the comedians actually pointed to the fact that when the European sanctions against Russian actions of the Kremlin were introduced, they said that the Kremlin agrees. They also introduced sanctions against Russia. The sanctions that hurt Russian consumers are in fact very much in line with the kinds of the sanctions that the European countries have introduced. True. I mean, when you look at the European countries, they're very different in size, and also the economies are very different in size. Smaller economies tend to have a structure where the most companies are SMEs, in fact, and as such, the SMEs have a very limited range, geographic range in terms of exports, and Estonia being a neighboring country of Russia, it makes only sense to have very high exposure to Russian markets. But I would like to underline once more that but there's economic reality, but there's also political reality, and we choose to make, or we make certain choices because of the values that we have and we espouse. And if our perceived partner is not able to be on the same page with us on these values, then then there's a parting of ways. Here, Estonia is not experiencing this departing of ways with the Russian market for the first time. In 1992, as Estonia started its Western integration, we were slapped with import tariffs that were 200%. This was supposed to drive Estonians back to a stronger Eastern integration. In fact, what it actually did was the fact that the companies saw that it is economically not viable to export to the East. There was even a faster integration to the Western market, and adaptation to the Western standards, also technical standards. It happened when there was a global financial crisis in 1997, and it has happened again. So I think in Estonia we have grown used to the volatility of the Russian market. Why people go there is because the extremely lucrative trade that you can make there, but trade can be lucrative only where the risks are high. So I mean, if you don't have the risk tolerance to be participating on the Russian market, you should not go there, as I understand. But also for I think you've seen throughout European unity in our statements here, and it couldn't be any other ways. But these experiences that we have made in our countries in diversifying our markets, in making our decisions based on these values and principles, this courage I would also wish to some European-minded Ukrainian businesses.
Thank you very much. Дуже вам дякую. Я зараз хотіла би надати слово представниці українського.
Thank you, and I would now like to turn the floor over to a representative of Ukrainian civil rights movement. This is Mrs. Maria Tomak, who is an expert on the human rights, and she is a member of the US-sponsored human rights organization. Thank you for this opportunity to inform you about the human rights violations that we detected in the course of events that we describe as the aggression of the Russian Federation, and we as a non-governmental organization, we deal with and we gather the information on the citizens of the uncontrolled territories of the Crimean Peninsula, and then we try to divulge this information at international level. I would like to highlight two aspects. First of all, I would agree with the sanctions policies pursued by Ukraine, I hope that at the last meeting in which we took part, we invited all the key stakeholders, and we hope that the Standing Committee of the Verkhovna Rada would initiate further changes to these sanctions policies vis-à-vis Russia, and that decision of the Verkhovna Rada would facilitate Ukraine's efforts at the international level to reinforce the sanctions. If we speak about specifically our relations with the EU, we also see here what we call the Global Human Rights Act. We can call it also a Magnitsky law, but of a global scale. At the EU on December the 20th, they are going to debate the draft of that document. And therefore, I would like to use this opportunity to express our support to this initiative. It was put forward by the Foreign Ministry of the Netherlands. I hope that this Magnitsky Act could be promoted at the global level. And having been involved in detecting these violations for the last 4 years, we have also been engaged in compiling the lists of the people whom we consider culpable, and we have presented those lists to different governments, for example, the United Kingdom government. And therefore, I would like to use this opportunity to call on the government of Ukraine to react to this arrest of the seamen, of the Ukrainian seamen. We see already some violations, that they were arrested and the lawyers were not allowed to visit them right away. They also are not qualified as the prisoners of war, but as the criminals. And the ones who committed the violation of territorial waters and border line. I hope that one of the ways of using, or one of the ways of struggling against these violations of human rights, there is a chance now to signal to those who commit these violations that their wrongdoings will not remain unanswered. Any questions or remarks or comments from the audience or participants?
In social media. So as a person connected 24/7 to Twitter, it was fun enough for me to see that while we were discussing how to preserve the European unity, I don't know if you have reached the information that the EU ambassador have just reached the agreement to sanction 8 individuals on who were involved in organization of illegal
elections.
That's a sign, isn't it?
It is.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tak, proszę.
I'll do this one. Hi, I'm Jim Brook, Ukraine Business News. I guess my question is largely for Ambassador Reichel. It's about the Sea of Azov, and if you step back in human economic history, freedom of the seas is not a natural phenomenon. There's been piracy for centuries, and since 1945 it's been maintained by the U.S. Navy. Obviously the U.S. Navy does not want to get involved, but Putin only respects force. He obviously doesn't respect treaties. There is serious talk. In fact, one of your own CDU politicians proposed banning trade with Russian ships leaving the Russian ports of Sea of Azov. Are there prospects for sanctions against products from Novorossiysk, which is not only Russia's only ice-free port, it is Russia's busiest port, and it's only 160 kilometers south of the Kerch Strait, and it would be the prime candidate for a trade-off: restore freedom of navigation in Azov, or forget about Europe and the US buying your products from Novorossiysk.
Дякуємо. Any more questions or commentaries? Yes, please.
Добрий день, вітаю всіх учасників.
I'm Serhii from New Europe Center. I would like to comment on your analysis, or rather our analysis. We wrote our political comments to the data that we put into that report, and we have heard many times the officials from Germany, from Italy, from France, from the other countries asking us what would, in your view, be the best argument to convince our citizens, the citizens of our country, that they should continue suffering these economic losses because of the sanctions. So from here, I derive a question: what are the attitudes of the business people of your countries that could any more arguments be involved, like, for example, the use of the scandals that some companies had while working in the Russian market. Like, for example, in Germany, there was a case, some scandal with Siemens company when Ukraine objected to the exports to the Crimean Peninsula, or some video clip to which there were objections made by Lufthansa, the video clip. Have you heard any objections or any claims by the businesses of your countries that they had some difficulties in the Russian market? Well, I think we need to thank all the participants for their questions, and let me remind also about my question about this difference between 78 million and 7 billion euros figure. So let us start with Mr. Ambassador, his last concluding remarks and answers to his answer to the questions that he has heard from the audience.
The Sea of Azov and freedom of seas. First of all, one has to note that the concept of freedom of seas doesn't apply to the Sea of Azov, because Russia and Ukraine, as it so happens, concluded a treaty which says that the Sea of Azov is shared territorial waters. Thereby, at least, it is very doubtful, and any third-party warships, at least, because that's also a point of discussion, would require the permission of both countries to enter, and you can imagine. Yeah? Further sanctions in a more broad sense, I've already addressed that. Yeah? It is, I think, the need to, and colleagues have also, the requirement to find a political basis for this inside countries, and then to find consensus within the European Union, and if possible also on a broader international scale, because if only one actor imposes sanctions, then others step in and benefit from the sanctions, as you know. This makes it pretty difficult to go as far as you have suggested. Attitudes of business in Germany, let me maybe try and answer on this question, because I'm freer to do so than maybe the representative of German business here at the table. The if you ask German business, 85% of those asked will say, we want to be left alone from politics and all of this. We just want to pursue our business, right? And it's a transgression of politics to tell us with whom we are supposed to do business. You know? That's the way they think, and it's natural for them. They have another set of goals than politicians have. You know? Then comes the issue, what Mr. Markus rightly pointed out, that there's a primacy of politics here, and the government is the institution to decide whether or not sanctions are imposed, and that has happened, as you know. But that doesn't mean that these people are happy now. Yeah? And then comes on top of this the good old American saying, all politics are local. Yeah? So you can have businesses in Germany or elsewhere who are comfortable more broadly with the idea of sanctions against Russia because they don't have as much business, but locally there may be a cluster of companies which actually have trouble because of this. And such local trouble can translate into country trouble. For those who have followed the series House of Cards, for instance, the big part of this is about the Port of Philadelphia. Yeah? And the Port of Philadelphia is a matter of top importance for the entire Washington politics machine. Yeah? And that's how politics work. Yeah? Maybe I would make one analytical, please understand, analytical remark on what my colleague Serhii Leshchenko said on Ukraine will make maximum demands. Yes, that's understood. I do see that, but analytically, I think one also has to see and take into consideration that excessive demands that have no chance of being fulfilled can have a harmful effect. They can have a harmful effect on the side which is making the demands because it tends to a reaction where your interlocutors don't listen anymore because they say, we know, they have all these maximal demands, but there's no way that we can do that anyway, so I'm not going to listen very carefully anymore. That's one potential consequence of this. And the other is that those who are against, for instance, sanctions, will turn to say, there you see, if we do sanctions, this is what the outcome of this is going to be. If we go down this road, at the end we will have the absolute maximalist set of sanctions, and who wants that? Then the response is likely to be, well, maybe not, or so at least that strengthens the opposition. Another analytical point I would like to make is, and that's my final one, you have done a very nice and valuable study about the macroeconomic effects of sanctions in EU countries. It would be useful to have a similar study on the macroeconomic effects of sanctions in Russia. And my suspicion is that you would probably find a similar result, namely that there is a moment of shock when the sanctions come into force, and that then comes this compensation kicks in. Yeah? And now, if that's the case, then the logical conclusion, a follow-on question is to say, okay, so are sanctions working or not working? Yeah? Are they inflicting harm or are they not inflicting harm? If you say they are inflicting harm, then there's a tendency to say, okay, then we don't have to kind of increase. But if you come to the conclusion it doesn't inflict harm, you can also come to the conclusion then the whole idea of sanctions is likely useless. And that's what the kind of aspect Russian messaging is working on. Yeah, to say, hold on. The Russian messaging is sanctions are not working, we are not feeling pain, so forget about that. Yeah? Of course you can, as I said, Ukraine is free to make all kinds of additional demands of what should be included in sanctions, but one has to bear in mind that the political traffic in the EU and elsewhere does not bear an indefinite increase of sanctions. Thank you very much.
Then, тоді я в такому разі просто повторю коментар, який прозвучав від мого колеги, що, можливо, в такому разі просто потрібна адаптація санкційної політики, так?
So in this case, maybe we should agree to one of our colleagues who mentioned that the sanctions policy should be adapted, not enlarged, not intensified, but adapted better. Dear colleagues, may I ask you who would like to make any concluding comments?
Case. Mr. Reichel is absolutely right that there are different interests. But when I'm going to the local level in the German Chamber of Commerces in the German regions, 99% of German companies, they are supporting the existing sanctions. Because what we see in the press, that is the lobbying of those companies who are working in Russia. But statistically, that is not the bigger part of what is happening in Germany. So if I'm going to the regions, I really the continuing or the stopping of sanction is very rarely. In the beginning there was a discussion, but now no one is standing up and saying, hey, Mr. Markus, you have to help us stop the sanctions. It doesn't happen.
Thank you very much.
I guess this has to do with who you speak to, because of course, if you are sitting somewhere in the countryside in Germany and you have local production people there, they don't care about Russia sanctions because they probably hardly export anyway. But if you speak to those on who the sanctions have effects, and this then gets multiplied by, in fact, the business associations in Germany, then what you hear is, leave us alone. Yeah? So, I mean, we have several business associations, to be fair, and some have taken the position you have described, like yours. The other one has taken a different one, yeah, and has been very critical of Russia sanctions over a period of 2-3 years, in fact. So I think somewhere, the truth is somewhere in the middle, let's say. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Csaba.
So, of course, I don't want to intervene into a very interesting inter-German discussion, but to a certain extent, it is also related to the answer to your question. And here I would like to precise that I can answer that part of the question of yours, which I know the explanation. So as to the 7 billion euro issue, the data is collected on a yearly basis from the local and economic players, actors, from the Hungarian firms. So it may differ from the macroeconomic statistics, but I think that the figure is reliable. It shows the real picture, and it might be a little bit more than the macroeconomic statistics would show, but I think it is true. My closing, but definitely not the final remark would be that I think that really the discussion on sanctions, on their effectiveness should be continued. Sanctions, in my fear, are part of the containment, but not really of the solution. And we have to work, we have to be much more creative diplomatically, politically, in order to find the right solution for your real challenges, what we have already mentioned several times. And I wish many success for this to you as well as to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Дуже дякую. Дуже дякую усім учасникам, які сьогодні проявили єдність і прийшли на наш круглий стіл.
Thank you all, dear participants, for your part in our today's discussion. And I would also like to invite you to our next event on December the 10th, which is titled Atrophy of the Trophies. How can Ukraine use its influence in the European Union countries better? And so thank you again for your participation.